Good afternoon, everyone. Cheers. I shouldn't be doing this because I'm actually meant to be working. You guys are a total bad influence on me. Someone just said in the comments, who was it a second ago? Mick just said, having a beer and looking forward to this one. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to join you. I'll also be having a beer tomorrow. So don't forget, tomorrow's live show's still on, guys. All the Sony news and rumours. So we'll be having that tomorrow. But cheers anyway. I was in a rush. I didn't even get time to put in my lemon or limes in this. So I thought I'd just get into these Corona extras. I will try some new beers and stuff like that, but I've got to finish these two first. I've bought a couple of cases. So I will finish that too. So say hi if you're in the chat. Love to see who's here. There's a few now popping in watching. So join me for a beer too, guys. You've got no excuse because it's late, especially if you're in the US and in the UK or wherever else. It's definitely beer o'clock. So join me now. Hi guys, so it's Nikhil, I think you pronounce it. Hi, how are you? I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes just to see if we can get a few more people on board, guys. So if you can, please give me a thumbs up because we'll see if we can get some more people over. I'd really appreciate if you can do that. Obviously, if I have a few more... If I have a few more of these drinks, once again, I'll be dancing on the table. Look at it focus, like it's unreal. See how quick it gets on there. Woo, look at that. La Servista, well, I can't even pronounce it. Mark's saying hi. Hi, are you, Mark? Studio is here as well. Phil's here as well. David Johnson's here. Ben's here. G'day for a beer. I know, Ben, it's a beautiful day today. Are you having one with me? Ben's a local photographer that's now starting to do some work with me as well. He's doing a wedding for me, a couple of weddings actually coming up. We're going to be working together, so looking forward to that. David Johnson's here as well, so hope you're having a beer as well, Ben. Ariel said, good idea, I know. Woo, get into it, guys. Got some really interesting things to talk to you today about the new Panasonic that's just been announced. And where... I think that Sony needs to put an answer out to this camera, so I thought we'd have a discussion about that today. I didn't really want to bring this up much tomorrow because tomorrow's discussion is more about, obviously, the Sony, more Sony-oriented discussion, so I thought I'd bring this out as a special discussion today. So I'm going to take you through the specs of what this new Panasonic G9 does, and then we can then have a chat about what we think Sony have to do to answer this camera, because at the moment there's a real, well, basically they're not answering the sort of lower end. Now, I know they've released the A7R III, and that's just come out recently, and just about to be released in the next couple of weeks. But there's nothing any lower than that. And the problem is, if you're dealing with the price of the A7R III, I'm not sure what that is in the States. Someone can let me know in the chat. But over here, it's around $5,000, I think, Australian. Well, there's nothing in this range of what the Panasonic G9 is, which is starting, I think, at $1,600 US, and it'll probably be about $2,200 Australian. It's roughly equivalent to about the Canadian price. So that's probably where this is going to be sitting. And therefore, I think Sony have to answer this with a sort of lower-end camera. And their perfect camera to actually answer this, remember, it's not the A6700, I don't think, is the answer to this camera. Really, the answer to this camera is the A7 III, which should, hopefully, Sony is going to announce. And perhaps this might be the thing that makes Sony push the A7 III a little bit more forward in their thinking to answer what this camera has. So I thought we'd go through the discussion about what this camera offers, and then we can sort of talk about that too. So in the questions, Tony said I've woken him up. In the questions, please, if you can, ask live ones, because I will bring that up at the end and we can have a discussion on the live questions. And seriously, if you think any questions you're not viewing live, you can leave them down below and I'll get back to you and we can have a discussion about that there as well, because I'm just curious. I'm just having a look at what a couple of people are saying here. Gregory said, I think Panasonic wants its customers to start taking Micro Four Thirds more seriously when it comes to photography. And look, as you know, the people that basically are on my, following me on YouTube also know that I have bought the GH5 recently because of the video aspect of it. That's what I bought that for. And this camera also interests me in some ways as well. And I'll talk about that at the end a little bit later. But I am hoping Sony answer this and have something equivalent, which we can talk about as we go on. So let's look anyway. So Panasonic yesterday, I'm going to have another drink. Michael's just joined us too. Michael, have a beer with me, mate. Crack one open. I'm going to enjoy this. You guys, seriously, bad influence. I shouldn't be doing this because I'm meant to be working. So Panasonic yesterday announced this G9. And it says it borrows a lot of the technology from the GH5. And in some ways it's improved things. In some ways it's left a little bit out compared to what the GH5 has. So I thought we could discuss this because it's a really interesting camera actually, what they're actually offering. The body itself is a little bit smaller than what the GH5 is, but incredibly well weather sealed. And I know even my GH5, I honestly think I could probably drop that in water and it probably may survive. This one is obviously very similar. It's got all the rubber gaskets all over it and incredibly robust if you're talking about weather sealing. It's far better, to be honest, than any of my Sony cameras. The GH5 is way better than anything that I could run with Sony. I always had an issue when I've been shooting weddings. I have always been a little bit scared. Now, I have taken my Sony gear out in quite extreme conditions, but it was always on the back of my mind that it may have an issue if it gets too wet. Whereas I don't think I'd have that issue with the GH5. So the weather sealing is sort of a big step up in that aspect. And I did also think when I bought my GH5, I did think, well, if ever I'm in a wedding and it's pouring down, I probably would just use my GH5 to capture the images and not worry about it getting wet. Because it is so well weather sealed. So that's an interesting thing that this camera has also got as well. So anyway, let's have a look at what this basically offers, because there are some things it leaves out, and we'll talk about that as well. Basically, if we go through, the G9 is going to be their flagship camera for doing stills. I suppose Panasonic have had to answer Olympus, because Olympus were much better in their stills area. But having said that, and this is what I want you to understand too, guys, that don't be so caught up on sensor size, because if you look at the video I just posted the other day, just let me make my watch go quiet, because otherwise it's going to keep ringing. If you look at the video I posted of the GH5, the stills on that camera is actually, I was actually quite surprised how good it was. It's still not as good as what my Sony is, obviously, but it did surprise me in the fact of how good it is, and I think this probably would be even a fraction better. So it did really surprise me actually in how good it actually was. So if you're looking at it, this is their flagship for stills. They're trying to relate this to more of a stills camera, and the GH5 is related more to video. But I suppose you can relate it a little bit like the Sony A9 as compared to the A7R III. The A7R III is more of a general camera that does it all. The Sony A9 is more geared towards photography. That's why Sony left out the picture profiles, I think, off the A9. I'm still hoping they put that on there, because honestly the video is better on the A9 than any other camera. It's a little bit crippled by not putting those profiles in there. But the A9 is definitely meant to be more of a still type camera. They're not promoting it as basically the video camera. They're promoting it as a sports, and I think it's the best wedding camera that's in the world, and I still don't think anything will still beat the A9 for that type of work. And if you want to sort of check my last video I put down, which was showing a dancer coming across the screen, you'll understand why I say the A9 is just so amazing. And I notice there's a lot of questions coming in, guys. I will come back to those as soon as I've gone through these specifications and we have a chat. So they're saying that it's basically, it is their flagship camera, and it has a similar processor to the GH5, only I think the actual the CPUs obviously inside the processors have been upgraded a little bit to give it more faster shutter speeds and things like that we'll talk around. It's got the GH5 sensor for the A9, but it's got better AF speed and performance. So as a result, the autofocus is as fast as 0.04 seconds under certain conditions. I mean, that's interesting how they say that. But I've found, honestly, in stills, the GH5 is incredible. The GH5, if you're talking about capturing stills for photography, is incredibly fast. It's just the video side of it sucks if you're dealing with autofocus. It's terrible. And I don't use it. And to be honest, I don't even use autofocus on the Sonys either. I always manual focus. The only time I'm using autofocus on my Sony camera is using the a6500 when I put it on a gimbal. And that can be a real advantage in doing that. And sometimes when I'm doing also my videos, if I'm walking towards the camera and things like that, I'll be using my a6500 or the a7R2, or even the A9 has incredible autofocus. That's where I'll use the autofocus. But if I'm dealing in a wedding type scenario, I do want to do manual focus because I want to make sure I've got control on what's being focused. And to be honest, these latest cameras, with the way you can punch it on the screen for focusing, with focus peaking and everything, manually focusing is no big deal, guys. So just don't make too much of a deal out of focusing for video. But with stills, the GH5 is incredible. I'd say it's easily as good as my a6500 in focusing for stills. But like I said, the second you turn over to video, it changes completely. But this is meant to be a fraction better. I mean, when I say a fraction better, I think the GH5 is rated at 0.05. This is 0.04. So they are saying it's a fraction quicker. But whether you'd notice that in real life use, I'm not actually sure. It's saying it's got high tracking performance. Again, we'll have to see what this is like when it's released, I suppose. It's a 20.3 megapixel sensor, so it's slightly less than what the a6500 has. But it will do 60 frames per second in AFS mode. Now, this is with the electronic shutter. So they're saying it'll do 60 frames per second, which I can't understand how on earth you could get that. That's just incredible. So we'll do that with AFS mode. If you want to use AFC continuous, it's 20 frames per second. So it's actually matching what the A9 has for continuous frames per second. But again, the resolution is slightly less. I do believe, though, if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, that's JPEG, though. It won't do that in continuous mode, in RAW. But I think you can use 20 frames per second in JPEG, in RAW, I think. AFC using the electronic shutter. In these modes, you can capture up to 50 RAW and JPEG images. So it'll do 50 RAW. But apparently that shutter speed, if you're dealing at 60 frames per second, you're going to fill that up in no time at all. So the buffer's not anywhere near as big as what the Sony A9 is. Plus, if you're looking at the focusing modes on this camera, this is no way near going to replace something like the A9. But remember, the interesting thing is, I don't think this is it's not in the same price bracket as what an A9 is. You know, you're talking about a camera that's 1,600 as against a camera that's, you know, around 4,000 US or $7,000 Australian, whatever I paid, which is just crazy. So I don't think it's still in that league, but if you're dealing with something you haven't got that money, this may be a camera that you'd like to sort of think about if you're dealing with sports and things like that. Now, the interesting thing is they're saying that it does have the electronic shutter, but I noticed when I was looking at Camera Store TV this morning, he had the camera on that review, and he did move it, and he did say that it was still affected by the rolling shutter, the same as he said the A7R3 is, and also the Nikon D850 all have rolling shutter, the electronic with the electronic shutter. The only camera that doesn't really have that is the A9, and I proved that when I looked at that dancing the other day shot. There's no rolling shutter on the A9 at all. You just don't get it. So that aspect is way ahead of what, say, this will be. But like I said, you're talking about totally different technology here and a completely different price range. It'll do 50 RAW and 50 JPEG images, and you can also do 6K and 4K photo mode for low resolution capture. And that's really interesting. It basically records it like video, and it does work really well. I've tried that on my GH5. And it'll do 9 frames per second with continuous autofocus, up to 600 JPEGs or 60 RAW files using the mechanical shutter. And the mechanical shutter is 1/8,000th of a second. The electronic shutter is 1/32,000th of a second. And I did mention when we were looking at one of the other things too, talking about the A9, and you cannot underestimate that 1/32,000th of a second. It is amazing. It's a game changer for me dealing in weddings. If I want to use fast glass outside and use low depth of field shooting wide open, I can get that with 1/32,000th of a second shutter. So that is incredible. And I just noticed someone down there said it is only contrast AF, and that's true. But having said that, whatever they do, voodoo they do when you're dealing with stills is incredibly fast. Trust me, I've used the A9 and the GH5. For stills, it is incredible. It doesn't beat the A9, but it is still incredibly quick in stills mode. Like I said, video, though, is a total different thing. It sucks. You also get 5-axis in-body stabilization. Now, this is a really interesting thing because they give you up to 6.5 extra stops. Now, I've shot at 1/10 of a second easily with my GH5 to get moving water, handheld, and it's really quite sharp. From what I've heard, looking at this, you could possibly almost shoot up to a minute, and it would be handheld still. I don't know how reliable that will be, but basically that's what they're saying. This is if you're using the in-body stabilization also with a lens that has stabilization on it as well. So, no, I think it was 10 seconds. I think they said you could shoot. They were talking about that on the Camera Store TV this morning, that you get up to about 10 seconds of still shots. So the stabilization on this is going to be amazing. In video particularly, the GH5, it's the best I've ever used with anything with stabilization. It does definitely beat Sony in the stabilization if you're hand holding. It has this thing like a tripod mode, which honestly you can almost get away with using a tripod or a monopod. It's that good. Well, this has taken that a step further. I think the GH5 is rated at 5.5 stops. This is rated at 6.5 stops. So therefore it'd be incredible for doing it in low light if you wanted to do long exposures. It packs a new $3,680 electronic OLED viewfinder, and it's a big 0.83 times magnification, and it's 120 Hertz refresh rate. Now, it also has what the A9 has. It's got no blackouts occur even in high-speed burst shooting, so it's no blackout at all. So again, that's a really nice thing too if you're capturing birds in flight or if you're doing it for still photography. Not still photography, for sports, for instance. And I had that advantage with getting the Dancer the other day with the A9 coming across the actual screen, and there was no blackout, so I could track her jumping and running across without any issues. Now, before we go any further, am I saying this will replace the A9? No, I'm not. I would never, ever replace my A9 with this camera. The reason is, obviously, the big one is going to be the rolling shutter that you're going to get with this camera as compared to using something like the A9. But if it was for still objects and things like that, well then that's something that's a little bit different. According to the Camera Store TV, who've used all the cameras, they actually did say that the Sony A9 was the only usable camera for rolling shutter with electronic shutter. This camera, the A7R III, and also the Nikon D850 was basically unusable in electronic shutter if you had anything moving. So that's one thing you've got to consider. This is going to have that same problem. They just don't have that same sensor like what Sony have got. But for the price you're paying, this may be a great camera for people just getting into sports and stuff. Let's have a look at what else they've got. It'll also do a similar thing to what Sony does with the pixel shift, only this will give you 8 images taken in succession. The Sony pixel shift moves the camera, or moves the sensor over 1 pixel at a time. This is doing half a pixel either way, so it's going to be a little bit more detailed than what the Sony pixel shift gives you. The other thing as well, which is an advantage, and that's a big advantage if you wanted to get into this technology, is the fact that this actually combines the images in camera. The problem with the Sony Pixel Shift 1 is you have to take the images and then you need to take them back home or use a laptop or something and then use software to actually combine those images together. That can be an issue because you don't really know what you're going to get until you get back to your studio or wherever you're going to put those images together. So the interesting thing with this is you could combine them together. It combines it in camera, and then you can check it immediately by enlarging to make sure there's nothing moving or a bit weird. Cheers. Let's come back to here, and I will come back to your questions, guys, because I do want to see what you guys are thinking about this. It works in RAW and JPEG as well, and I think it gives you an 80 megabyte file size. 80 megapixel file size, I think, is the size that it gives you. It just says it offers the highest quality in Lumix camera to date. Now, this is a thing that Sony do have to answer, and this is something I keep saying all along, and it's the reason why I bought the GH5. What they're saying here is that on the video front, the Panasonic G9 can record 4K at 60 frames per second. So again, even though they're saying this is a stills camera, they're still giving you the ability to shoot 4K. Now, is there issues with that? Yes, because you can only do it for 10 minutes. So that's one big issue, and I suppose they can't give you, from what I read this morning, they haven't got the same heat sinks and things like that that the GH5 has got, where you can record 4K 60 without it overheating. The GH5 does not overheat, even doing 4K 60. So that's one big difference, I suppose. They're saying that they haven't got the same heatsink, so they can't allow that to happen. The other thing, I suppose, too, is they may want to say, if they added too much in this, then you wouldn't buy the GH5. But it does do 4K 60, but it doesn't have 10 bits. So if you do want to do 10-bit 4K 60, you still have to buy the GH5. But still, I shoot the GH5 an awful lot with 4K 60. I shoot nearly everything in 4K 60. It gives me the ability to slow the bride down if she's walking and things like that, and then I can just reduce that speed by 50% and get beautiful slow motion in 4K. We can't get that in Sony at the moment, and it's one thing I just really hope Sony bring out, and it's one thing that they've got to answer soon. I'm hoping that just isn't in the new A7S3 or whatever it is. I'm also hoping they bring that out in an A6 700,000 or whatever that's going to be. I'm really hoping. I think they have to answer that side of it shortly. So it does only give you in 420 8-bit. But it's at 150 megabytes per second data rate, so that's pretty good. But I was surprised. I really didn't think they would give you 4K 60p in this. I thought that would be limited to 4K 30 to really make you get the GH5 if you needed the video aspect of it. But to be honest, I think this is a perfect B cam, because for me, I only need one camera that can record 4K 60p that's on constantly all the time, that will run all the time. The rest of the time, a 10-minute lockout doesn't bother me at all, because I'd only be shooting things that are for 5, 10, 15 seconds at the most. So having this as a B cam for something like the GH5 or anything else could be a really good camera, because you're dealing with, at least you have 4K 60p and you can record for 10 minutes, which is probably ample for what you need. Obviously, they're saying if it goes longer than that, it would overheat. So that's what they're saying, the reason why they haven't given you that. The 10-bit doesn't really bother me that much. I don't use that very much at all on my camera, because the file sizes end up being massive, and it fills up a 128 gigabyte card. It fills it up in something like 15-20 minutes of recording. It gets crazy. So I don't use it very much at all. So that's one big advantage with this camera against anything Sony has at this stage, is you've got 4K 60p on it. It's got the 3-inch touchscreen, and obviously even the fully articulating screen, which is another really big feature as well that I wish Sony would come out with, to be able to have that screen that flips out and folds back towards you if you wanted to do blogging or whatever, even if you're just filming yourself for doing vlogs, things like that. It's such a big advantage to have that. And that screen works amazingly. It's amazingly bright to use in daylight, so that's another thing as well. What else is it saying? Not much else. So they're basically the things of this. A few things that I think are amazing. 4K 60p, definitely. Even though it's a 10-minute lockout, it will turn itself off after 10 minutes. I still will be happy that as a B camera. For the still side of it, you're getting 9 frames per second mechanical, up to 1/8,000th of a second. You're getting 1/32,000th of a second in electronic shutter, and you've also got the 4K 6K photo mode, and you've got the 60 frames per second and also the 20 frames per second using AFC. So what I want to do is I want to open it up to you guys, because I'd love to see what some of you say in the questions about this camera. So I'm going to bring that up. and we can go through some of the discussions once I've had a drink. Cheers, guys. All right, so let's see what some people are saying. Most people at the beginning there are just saying hello. Nikhil said, I just sold my D5300 a few days back and I'm planning to switch to mirrorless. Which Sony mirrorless should I buy? A6000 or A6300? Definitely, if you've got the money, the A6300 is the better one of those two, Nikhil. Definitely, the A6300 is a great camera. Phil Williams said, if I did a live feed, I'd need 5 beers at least. Like I said, I've got to work after that. I've got to do some editing. I'll probably have another one. That'll be the end of me. Tony said, thanks for waking me up. No worries, Tony. Good to see you here. I think Panasonic wants its customers to start taking Micro Four Thirds more seriously when it comes to photography. And like I said, the issue was at the moment, yes, the Panasonic was better in video, but Olympus were better in stills, if you're talking about Micro Four Thirds. So they may have answered that now as against the Olympus. So it's an interesting camera, that's for sure. Michael said, hey, where's my A7 III? When you're meant to be getting it, Michael? It's pretty soon, isn't it? Gregory Gris said they may be trying to get some of the market, but they'll never get pro photographers to get on board. Yeah, and you could be right, Gregory. I'm not sure. Like I said, I was surprised at how well the actual GH5 worked in photography. If you don't think it's any good, check out my video just a couple of videos back that shows me shooting the GH5 with the 42.5mm, which is the equivalent to 85mm, 1.7 lens. Have a look at that and you might be surprised how good the GH5 actually is for stills, to be honest. I still will be using my Sony gear though for stills, but I'll tell you what, if I didn't have the Sony gear and I had no camera at all, after doing those shoots I wouldn't hesitate to use the GH5 for stills. What else have we got? What do you expect from the A7S III? Well, for starters, it has to have 4K 60. I think they have to answer the GH5. They've got to answer that camera, and probably the reason why it's taking so long is because Sony are probably trying to work out how to stop the camera from overheating. Remember, you can have overheating issues at the moment if you shoot 4K. Well, if you're dealing with 4K 60p and then you start throwing in like what the GH5 has now, which is 400 megabytes per second on their images, which is incredible. Look at the specs of the GH5 and see what it can offer for video. It's unbelievable. It'll give you 4K 60. It'll also give you 10-bit. It'll even give you a 400 megabits per second recording bit rate. So I think Sony are probably trying to work out how they can get over that overheating issue that is probably there. They've got to make sure if they release this, it doesn't overheat, hopefully. So I think for starters, they will probably have to answer that. So they're going to have to bring out a camera that has 4K 60p. That's a must. 120 frames per second would be amazing if they could get up there for slow motion, and obviously a higher bit rate. Now clearly the autofocus, I'm hoping they grab the autofocus from the A9. If they put the autofocus from the A9 into an A7S, just imagine what that camera could do. It would be incredible. So I think that's probably where they're going to take the A7S III down. But remember, I suppose the issue for most people is going to be the cost of what that camera will be. It's probably going to be way over, I reckon, to be $5,000 US at least. So it is going to be a very expensive camera, so you are going to pay for it. I think the more interesting debate is Sony now should bring out an A7 III to combat this camera, and I think that now has to be in Sony's radar, is to bring out something that can combat this camera for around that same price range. Because remember, at the moment, starting at A7R III is a bit ridiculous for some people. They're losing all of these customers that are more in the lower end. Yes, they may get the A6500, but if you want to get a full frame camera, you have to now jump up to the A7R III, which is quite expensive if you're dealing with paying $3,400, whatever it is, US, for an intro for the first camera that Sony offer in full frame. Because let's face it, the A7 II now, you would not buy the A7 II now. If you're comparing it to what's released now, it's way back in technology. So I do think that Sony now have to offer an A7 III. to combat this. Now, whether they give you more frames per second, obviously they need to up the autofocus. The autofocus has to be obviously increased. But I would not be surprised now if Sony announced this moves their announcement a little bit forward, because I think they won't possibly want people in that entry area to jump in and say buy something like this Panasonic. They'll want to try and grab those people into Sony. That's the way I'd be thinking if I was Sony, is trying to make sure that those people don't move to that format and they can buy a Sony camera that's at a similar price range. What else does it say? Michael said, any camera these days can look good if you have good lighting. So true, Michael. The one area where Sony excels is in low light, and that's the area the Panasonic just can't compete with. That micro four third camera cannot compete with what Sony will give me in low light scenarios. If I was shooting in a wedding reception or whatever, I'm just going to pull out my Sony. I mean, look, I could shoot with the GH5 as long as you add lighting. You can go up to 3200 in the ISO without really much of a penalty at all on the GH5. But if you have to go above that, 6400, it does start to suffer on the GH5, whereas I could easily shoot that with my A9 or the A7R3. You could easily shoot at 6400 if you needed to. To be honest though, the way I'm starting to shoot now is I'm adding light into the reception, so it's no longer that much of an issue. I very rarely go over 1600 ISO for me now, so light really becomes not much of an issue anymore, and I've got ample ISO in anything I use. But you definitely can't beat the Sonys for low light. Even the Canon that I used recently with the Profoto A1, when I was testing that, the Canon 5D Mark IV was nowhere near as good as what my A9 was giving me for grain and low light. Philip William Film said iPhone Pix and Android can look great too. They can, and I'm going to do a test with the iPhone X. I'm actually going to try and do a model shoot for you guys, and I'll take it out and do some and show you how good that camera can perform in good light. What else? Studio, yeah, I said before, Studio 96 said G9 is contrast only, no match for the A9. And I think you're correct. It's not going to be an answer to the A9, but you're dealing with a camera that's 1,600 US against something that's 3,400 or whatever the A9 is. You wouldn't expect them to really compete in that area. But I have to tell you, like I said, if you're dealing with just general photography using the GH5, and I haven't used the G9, but the GH5 for stills photography in good light, like if you were doing a football game in good light, is incredible. It is unbelievably fast. Trust me, I've used both cameras. You would be surprised how good it is. Little Boo said, I'm late. Michael said, David, stop drinking. Sony is our world. We're slaves to the Sony gods, laugh out loud. It's the drinks, it's the darkness. I love it, Michael. Michael said, love David, my go-to guy. That's funny. At least you see it as it is, Michael. It's like I said to you, I'm always going to tell you guys the truth. Am I going to change to this from Sony? No, I'm not. Sony, for me, is still a way better system, but this is a wake-up call that Sony have to release something to answer this. Sony, look, yes, Sony have released the A7R3. They've also released the A9. The A6500, what was that now, about 12 months ago? They have to release an A7 III now. This is the point that I'm trying to make on this, and this is why when I put this on, I'm saying, does Sony have an answer to it? They will have, but it's got to be the A7 III, because they have to bring out a camera that's priced similar to this, that has similar features to what this offers. For basically the entry professional or hobbyist photographer that wants a full frame camera that has similar features to what they've sort of given you here. So I think they do have to answer it. And remember, the thing for me is, look, I love Sony. I am a bit of a Sony, I wouldn't say geek, but I do love what Sony has to offer. But again, I'm not blind to what's going out there. Remember, I did change from Nikon to Sony. I'm not saying I'm going to switch back, and I probably wouldn't ever now switch back anywhere because I'm too invested now and I'm getting too old to change again. But the thing with this whole system is I have now started to get into the GH5, and to be honest with you, I'm loving what that's giving me for the video side of it all. It's incredible for the price of what that camera is the 4K 60, once you start shooting that, you can't go back. And plus the lenses are so cheap. So if you want to get into things a lot more cheaply and give you reasonable work, well, this may be a great camera. And once again, I'm just going to tell you the truth as I see it, guys. Remember, I'm not sponsored by anyone. There's no way I'm ever going to be made into a Sony ambassador or anything like that because I'm from Australia. We're too small a market over here. But either way, even if that ever happened, I would still be telling you guys the truth because it's just what I want to do. I never want to be basically people to say you've just got blinkers on and you don't see anything else that's out there. So, and I know you understand that, Michael. Studio Vienna said, pixel shift combined in camera sucks. If the picture have defects, there is no way to fix it. With the Sony solution, you can fix it in Photoshop with blending layers. Yeah, well, you can, Studio 96, but the problem is if I think it's the Olympus version I've seen and used, and that works incredibly well. You might be surprised how well that works. The issue is if you're dealing with it later on, if there's an issue with something moving, well, then you can stack over it, but it's an awful lot of work. If it works the same way as the Panasonic one works, it actually is a very good system. Michael said, I'm going to buy GH5 because of David, just because he likes it so much, I'm in. And you know what, Michael? You would change, I'm telling you. Once you shoot 4K 60p, you can't go back. It's just, to be able to slow that bride down walking in 4K is unbelievable. It's gorgeous, and that's the thing. I can't understate that enough, and that's I've just been hanging out for Sony to release something, and they just don't do it. It's tough. I really wish they would. Look, it's still not my favourite camera. My favourite camera is still the Sony A9. By far, that's the most favourite camera I've got. So even though I'm glowing about the GH5 for video, the Sony A9 is still my favourite camera all up that I've ever had. Gregory Griss said, this is a smart move for Panasonic. They're showing more contrast between G series and GH series. G7 and G85, GX85 just look like both baby GH cameras till now. Now the G can be photocentric while GH are video, yeah, and I think that's probably what they've aimed at. And it's interesting the comment before about saying professionals will not go over, and I think sometimes we're way too hardware. We think way too much on the hardware side of it, guys. Remember, it's not the hardware that matters, it's the image. Remember, it's the emotion and it's the image that matters. No matter what you shoot, if you're a good photographer, you will get a beautiful image with any camera that's released today. Obviously, some cameras you will like more because it's your personal preference, but don't go thinking down the line that you can't shoot amazing images with a Fuji camera, with a Panasonic camera, with Olympus camera, with Sony, Canon. You can shoot amazing images with all of them, guys. Don't go down this line of saying professionals won't change and won't shoot with that. I honestly think that's a load of rubbish, to be honest, because to be totally honest, the client does not care what you shoot with. My clients would not give a hoot if I was shooting with Sony, Nikon, Olympus. They hire me for my images. They do not hire me for the gear that I'm using. So just remember that when you're dealing with talking about cameras. I should have another beer after that little rant. What else have we got? Little Ray Blue said, I think Panasonic's answer to the Olympus EM1 Mark II. This is for Panasonic customers. Yeah, and it probably is to hold them. It's probably a very smart move for Panasonic to release this camera at a good price point, I think, for what they're offering. Like I said, it would be a good camera, and the thing that's holding me back from getting this camera, because I look at this camera and I think it'd make a great B camera for me. Would I use this for stills? No, because I've got amazing Sony gear. Now, I'm still going to use my A9 and A7R2 for the stills. I could use that for stills though if I wanted to travel or do something like that with it, but the reason I would buy this camera is for the 4K 60p. The 10-minute time limit does not bother me because as a second camera, this would be incredible to be able to shoot 4K 60p. The issue for me at the moment is I love shooting the GH5 for the 4K 60p, but then the second I then want to use a second camera, I'm then down to 4K 30p. And it's annoying that I haven't got that option. I would love Sony to come out with a 4K 60p to give me that option. So please, Sony, I'm begging you, bring out a 4K 60p. 60p camera. What else? Richard said he's late, so it's good to see you here. Gregory said, I actually did watch your GH video and the camera has fantastic images. How did they hold up to print? I haven't printed them, Gregory, but I know what they like in Lightroom and Photoshop, and they would be fantastic in print. I'm experienced enough now to know how they would print. Everything is calibrated on my computer, like down to the inch. So I know they would print fantastic. There'd be no issue at all. If I did print them, they'd look as good as anything else that I've got, to be honest. Do you find the price of a Sony A9 in Melbourne? Yes, it's 5,000, Resi. I've noticed prices just recently come out. Like I said, I'm not going to buy that camera yet. I may next year, depending on what Sony release next. I'm still waiting to see what they come out with over the next coming months. Little Blue said, Sony losing me no A7 III. And this is what I'm saying to Sony, that they have to be careful that if they don't look after these people that are at the lower end of this scale, the people that are just sort of have the money to just buy in at an entry-level camera, they are going to lose a lot of people to other systems. And this is where they have to be careful. And this is why Sony really should release an A7 III. I actually was surprised that they didn't release the A7 III before the A7R III, to be honest, but I think it may have been that Sony wanted to answer the Nikon D850, but I'm not sure why that happened. Keith's here, so hello, Keith. Little Ray Blue said, I have my Panasonic locked at 3200 ISO. Yeah, like I said, I don't go over 3200 either. Keith Alexander Bailey said, I think Canon Mark IV is the same as the Sony A7R in low light and noise. No, it's not. Keith, I've used it myself and it was nowhere near as good as what the Sony... Oh, well, I haven't used the A7R, but it was nowhere near as good as my A7R II or the A9. Nowhere near as good as what I had on that camera. I noticed that straight away, that it was nowhere near as good as those cameras. Keith said, Sony does have shooters in Down Under. Yes, there's a lot of Sony shooters out here. Quite a lot. More for video, though, than stills, I have to say. Keith Bailey said, Sony... Oh, yeah. Michael said, yes, I understand I'm on chat. I know you are, Michael. Keith Alexander Bailey said, Michael Pierce, go for it. Keith said, give me any camera I'll shoot with. And that's the thing, guys. Remember, it's all about it's all about your skills as a photographer. It's not about the gear you use. We can be too gear-centric sometimes, and it is more about the image itself. Remember that. Your clients will not care what you're shooting. Mel said, Sony need not have to answer. It is working on its own game plan. Remember that the A9 and G9 are different price brackets, and that's true. If any, the A7 III will be in the same league, but it won't do 20 frames per second. Yeah, they can't give you 20 frames per second in that, Mel. But they still have to bring out a camera that is enticing for people at that entry level, remember? And that's the problem at the moment. They haven't got a camera full frame that's enticing people at the entry level. So they do have to stop people going to other systems. Because remember, once they go to other systems, you've lost them. So I do believe that Sony have to answer that. They have to have a camera down at that lower end, and that has to be the A7 III. That's just my opinion, though. You may not agree with that. So let me know, guys, in the chat whether you agree with that statement or whether you agree with what Mel says. Keith said there will be an A6800 and an A7000 coming soon. And, yeah, they may be. I'm hoping so. I'm hoping that there's, say, an A7000 coming with 4K 60p. That would make my day. And that would be one camera I'd buy. Shaku said, photographers always say the gear doesn't matter, then go crazy whenever a new camera comes out. And I'm the same. I'm exactly the same because we're geeks. We love the gear. That's half of the problem. But at the end of the day, to be totally honest, it can make a difference in getting a shot. Like I said, I could never have got that shot that I got the other day with the Dancer with any other gear that I've got. Because using the A9 the other day enabled me to shoot in natural light, to get using continuous focus, having the Dancer run across the screen and getting that shot. So yes, in that scenario, the gear matters. That definitely helped me to get the image that I needed. So therefore, yes, technology does matter. But if you're dealing with just normal portraits and things like that, honestly, the gear would not matter that much. The gear in that scenario, it's more about the image more than the gear. So certain cases, the technology does matter, yes. Certain areas, it doesn't matter so much. Studio, for instance, the gear doesn't matter as long as you've got enough resolution. Really, I mean, you can shoot amazing images in studio with even any camera that's out there. My A6500 can do incredible studio images, but you know that's a different scenario. What else have we got? Studio Vienna said Mel and quiz exactly. He's talking about the 20 frames per second. Yeah. Mel said the future A6700 might stack up, and it might. The only thing is it's not going to be full frame though. Mel, that's the thing, I suppose, about it. But at higher frames per second, 4K 60p, the small body will still overheat, and that's the issue. I think that's what's stopping Sony from releasing the A7S III at the moment, is they have to overcome that heating. I think they're possibly going to need a bigger body and some better heat sinks or something like that. But they obviously have to answer that, and it has to be not overheating. So... He's saying, but the higher 4K 60p, the small body will still overheat. If Sony is to respond to either the A6-7000 size is revamped or a new line is created. Yep, I agree. Mick said, I think the APS-C version of Sony will release 4K 60 due to being 24 megapixel before full frame high megapixel. And you may be right, Mick. That might be the answer to it. They may answer this with a A6-700 that gives you that 4K 60. But like I said, they're going to be interesting to see how they can get overheating, because I'm telling you at the moment, there's no way in that body you could run 4K 60p. Like it can overheat, and it hasn't happened to me, but it can overheat at 4K 60, 4K 30. If you're trying to push 4K 60, that's a hell of a lot more data, and it would run a lot hotter. So that, yeah, they'd have to come up with a solution to that. So I'm not sure how it will happen. Mel said, remember that A7Ss are 35 full frame, not micro four thirds. Yep, true, Mel, I understand what you're saying there. So to come up with something close, it has to be APS-C. The A7 price is too high, and the overheating problem will always haunt us. And you might be right, Mel. The answer to this might be an A6-7000. That could be what Sony have to release to answer this. You've got a similar, well, the sensor size is bigger in the A6000 series, so that might be the way that they actually do it. Richard said, just bought a used A7R II, fantastic camera. Richard, I still love my camera. I would not sell that camera, particularly because it's still got Play Memories apps on it, and I can also then override the shutdown at 30 minutes. So it's an amazing camera and great buy at the moment. I would recommend anyone that is struggling with money to buy the A7R II. Great camera. Little Blue said, hard to beat the Ibis. It is. The Ibis, honestly, in that camera, the GH5 is insane. How much I can hold that camera steady without a tripod. And the G9 is going to be even better. It's truly, you've got to hold it to believe it, how good it is. That new tripod mode that it has in there is incredible, how still that holds when you stand there and even just move gently. It literally looks like it's on a tripod. It's amazing. It's like voodoo science. Like I said, we're nearly at the end of that chat. If you're coming in later, please leave these down below, some questions down below, because I'd love to know what you think about this and whether you think that Sony have to answer this with the new A6-700 series, something like that, you know, because I do think that's possibly the camera that they have to bring out. I am hoping that they don't wait too long with the A7 III, because I do think that also has to come out to have an entry-level full frame camera as well, which, you know, like I said, the A7 II is just too old now. Nightbot said, I stole the red weapon. I tricked the dirty bastards into believing I was a CNET editor. That's interesting. So any last questions, guys, before we go? Don't forget, tomorrow I'm going to have the normal Sony rumours and news up, because that's going to be Sony related. So it's sometimes I throw other things in there, but that's definitely more Sony related to what I normally talk about. That's why I thought I'd discuss this today, because I didn't want this to come into the Sony news feed tomorrow. So we'll still have that tomorrow. That'll be on about the same time as I ran today. So if you wanted to tune into that, you can see that tomorrow. And then I've got weddings that start to pick up. So I've got a wedding I'm doing the weekend, so I might show you even some of that over the weekend. I've got a lot of other videos too that I've got to post too with other things as well. Keith said he has to go, so catch you next time, Keith. Hopefully you'll pop in tomorrow for tomorrow's live. Michael said, I think we're at a place that 60p for pro video shooters is where we're at. a must if you want to compete. I think Sony A9 video with 60p in all the Sony new cameras, I would never eat. I know, I agree with you. Imagine that camera, Michael. If you could put the Sony, if they gave like the Sony A9, and I don't know whether they'll ever do this because you'd never buy another camera. But if you could get the Sony A9 with its focusing and video is incredible, the low light is incredible. If you could get that camera with 4K 60p with profiles, unbelievable. And I think that's probably what the A7S III is going to be. But remember, and this is why they're going to separate the cameras. This is why I wouldn't be surprised if they bring out an A9S. Because if it's an A9S, they can bring that out video related. You won't have the 20 frames per second. It will only have the 8 or whatever it is, frames per second. And then the A9 will be more still centric. I think that's the way this is going to go. So I don't know if we're going to get picture profiles on the A9, guys. I just don't think it's going to happen. But what an amazing camera if you could get that. Shaku said, so what is Canon doing? Nothing. That's a problem. I just can't believe it. I mean, honestly. Canon, I just don't understand what Canon are doing in this marketplace. It's just crazy. They should be doing something. Gregory said, thanks for your input, David. When will you do a website critiques? Yeah, I might do that soon. I just haven't had time at the moment, but I may do that, Gregory, somewhere along the line. Mel said, for 2008, we need new updates on the A6500 and A6300, at least a token APS-C lens, and they should bring out new lenses for that. But you know what, guys? You hear all the time people saying that the full-frame lenses, I use full-frame lenses on my A6000 series all the time, and they work amazing. But yeah, they probably should release lower-end APS-C lenses. I wish they would do that. But I do agree, they do have to upgrade that camera now. It's due now for an update, I think. Like I said, 4K 60p would be perfect. Mel said, Canon cannot respond. It does not have the tech at this time. No Ibis, no 4K weak, Digix 7, etc. And it's sad. I really do hope that they can do something about this. Because like I said, competition is a great thing for all of us, guys. So just don't wish any company to go broke. Have so many great Canon lenses. That's cool. Keith, oh yeah, he's saying goodbye to Keith because Keith's leaving for the day. So, well, that might be just about it, guys, because I think there's not many more questions coming up. Any last questions before we call it a day? Any other questions, leave them down below because I'd love to get your opinion about what you think about this, whether you think it should be an A7 III or whether you think it should be an A6 7000, something like that. Also put whether you think 4K 60p does matter to you because I'm curious to know whether you think that matters. It definitely does for me, for my business, doing both stills and video. 4K 60p is a massive thing for me now. Like I said, now that I'm shooting with it, I can't go back. So that might be it, guys. I'm going to finish my beer, and probably I might even go for a second one while I'm editing this afternoon. And I'll see you for tomorrow's live news feed. Look forward to seeing you all for that. Any questions, think of them overnight, and you can get me tomorrow in the live feed and ask them there. So that's it, guys. So good day from down under, and I'll see you all again soon for tomorrow's video. So catch you, guys. Thanks, Michael, so much, mate. Bye.